Salutations, fellow nerds. I'm Rick Y, and today is February 24th, 2025. There have been some pretty dramatic updates when it comes to Europe and the new role that America will be playing in the future. From Ukraine to European relations to global security abroad, the Trump administration has set in motion some pretty cataclysmic events that will undoubtedly shape the near future. So if you dig news, history, or just humorous American hogwash, make sure to throw a blue heart or a middle finger or an emoji of some sort of tuber vegetable into the comments. I don't care. First and foremost, let's start with some things because I've noticed there's some confusion out there in the internet universe about the war in Ukraine and events that have caused it. Some feel that it was Biden single-handedly allowing Ukraine into NATO, which is as absurd as it is impossible, and others feel as though the trouble began much sooner than that. But the general consensus being that while Russia did invade sovereign territory, they did so because of a threat that Ukraine posed. Given all of this confusion, I thought I would clear some things up, especially since it also demonstrates that Russia's been playing the same insidious political games in other countries as they have been found to have been meddling here. 2004 and 2005 were pretty tumultuous years in Ukraine, and a lot of folks here in America are actually completely unaware of the events that took place. First, a man by the name of Viktor Yanukovych was declared the winner of the Ukrainian presidential election of that year. The problem with that is that he won through widespread voter fraud and election fraud. Now, while this sounds familiar, that's primarily because it is. The difference is the pro-Russian candidate won the election with a massive amount of evidence to prove that he was never actually the legitimate nominee. Outside monitors of the elections reported ballot stuffing, intimidation tactics, and huge media bias discrepancies that were sometimes outright lies. Then, in the exit polls, opposition candidate Viktor Yushchenko was found to have won, but for some reason the victory was just handed to the pro-Russian candidate. There were also voter suppression and intimidation tactics. Some Ukrainians weren't even allowed to vote. The government also handed out illegal absentee ballots in order to help those in favor of Yanukovych, the pro-Russian candidate, in the voting twice. There was then the poisoning of Yushchenko with dioxin, a commonly used assassination chemical used by Russian agents. And at this point, the Orange Revolution began and a revote was cast. With greater security measures in place, the winner of the election turned out to be Viktor Yushchenko. This pissed off the government of Russia at the time. Who was the leader of Russia? Well, that would happen to be Vladimir Putin. Now, fast forwarding a little bit here to 2008, and we're here in Bucharest for the NATO summit. Given the highly democratic resistance to the threats by Russia and an authoritarian government, NATO members were impressed with Ukraine's people and their dedication to a new and democratic Ukraine. The Orange Revolution was a massive effort by the citizens of Ukraine to stop the transition of power into the hands of a pro-Kremlin puppet government and instead demanded their rights to a free and fair election. What started as hundreds of thousands of people protesting in the streets later became millions of pissed off Ukrainians ready for change. Why was it the Orange Revolution? That was the color of the candidate fighting against Russian interests. Civil disobedience was all over the nation, and eventually their Supreme Court had to step in, and they ruled in favor of the protesters and called for a revote due to the widespread voter fraud. This was a victory, as it proved that peaceful demonstration can overturn rigged elections. So, of course, Western countries finally saw the determination of the Ukrainian people and promised membership at an undisclosed time in the future. This was also hugely supported by then Republican President George W. Bush, as it was clear there would be a border state willing to work with Western democratic interests. Consider this Vladimir Putin's supervillain origin story, as it was clear his goals of reunifying a Soviet Union were slipping out of his hands. The next few years would be complicated to say the least, as although the democratic powers won the Orange Revolution, corruption was still widely problematic in the government. Failed reforms and economic struggles left a lot of Ukrainians feeling disappointed and disillusioned, and many began to feel that although the Orange Revolution was successful, it failed to bring real change in their lives. Long story short, the pro-Russian president won his bid to regain power, and in 2006, he returned to the seat he claimed had been stolen from him. If all of this sounds stupidly familiar, good news, You're tracking. In 2013, he rejected an EU trade agreement and aligned with Russia. This sparked nationwide protests across Ukraine, and unlike peaceful protests years before, security forces were deployed against the protesters and began to shoot them down. During what were called the Euromaidan protests of 2013 and 2014, 108 protesters were killed fighting for democracy. They would be known as the Heavenly Hundred, or Nebesne Sotnya. All of this led to Yanukovych being ousted after all of the turmoil and chaos when he bounced from Kyiv to Russia. At this point, the government had officially collapsed as the pro-Russian leader was unable to quell the protests and restore peace. An acting president and prime minister were then appointed and began a new pro-European democratic government in February of 2014. Russia's failure at capturing Ukraine internally through deception and violence pushed Ukraine even closer to European integration. The very next month, seeing that he could not capture Ukraine through coercion, he thought he'd do so through force. So Putin sent in forces to illegally annex and take Crimea with what would be referred to as little green men, because they wore no military insignias with green military uniforms. An illegal referendum was then staged by Russia as the West responded to this unlawful invasion of sovereign territory with nothing heavier than sanctions. A month after that, pro-Russian separatists, backed by the Russian government, seized government buildings in Ukraine, which kicked off what was called the Donbas War. Russia provided to the separatists weapons, ammunition, and intelligence support to embolden and strengthen the effort to cause strife within Ukraine itself among its own people. The violence eventually led to a crescendo as Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was shot down over the region by Russian-supplied Buk missile, killing 298 people. Eventually, after denying all involvement, investigators confirmed their responsibility. It was at this point that Europe had to get involved, and in 2015, the Minsk Agreement was signed to halt the war, and Russia never complied to its terms while continuing to funnel weapons and supplies to the separatists. If you're keeping up, what that means is back then, Putin was doing the exact thing that he is now claiming that the United States and the West is currently doing in Ukraine. Ain't that the damnedest? 2018, Russia attacks the Ukrainian Navy while seizing 3 of their vessels near Crimea, and 24 sailors are captured. 3 years later, Russia begins massive troop buildups near the border of Ukraine in 2021. Putin then demands that NATO block Ukraine from joining, which NATO rejects. Putin then demands that NATO withdraw all military assets from Eastern Europe, and again, block Ukraine from joining. And again, NATO, along with the US, refuse and call the demands unacceptable. February 21st of 2022, Russia claims that parts of Ukraine, a sovereign nation, are now independent republics, signaling their complete failure to uphold the Minsk agreements. And Russian troops then enter the area under the mission of peacekeeping. 3 days later, Russia formally invades Ukraine. While still lying and denying what everyone could clearly see, Putin claimed there was no war while invading from 3 different fronts and bombing Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Mariupol. In summary, Russia invaded Ukraine as a way to try and do what they've been trying to do since 2014. Full stop. Russia are the invaders, they're the aggressors, and they're the criminals. And yet Donald Trump has recently declared Ukraine the aggressors and used 100% Russian propaganda in order to sell his position. He then went on to say that he was going to negotiate peace between the countries without Ukraine's involvement or consent, while claiming their current duly elected president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is a dictator. Meanwhile, siding with the Russian authoritarian who has overstayed his rule by decades and does so through assassinations and violence, as Zelensky has offered to abdicate his leadership if Ukraine is allowed into NATO. That's right. With almost 60% approval, the man who is volunteering to step aside for a unified Ukraine is somehow the dictator in all of this. You would have to be taking all of your talking points from the Kremlin or ignore history to side with Russia on this situation. As the new German chancellor rips into Trump for this obvious capitulation to Putin, every European leader is now considering a future without America at its side. An allegiance free and unified against the potential outcome that we side with fascists and further betray our alliances to them since World War II. And while Trump is trying to sell himself as someone who wants peace, he's doing so through the tactics of maybe DC Comics peacekeeper. He's going to turn Gaza into more room for the lifestyles of the rich and famous, and he's going to somehow sign over Ukraine to its greatest geopolitical enemy. While conservatives are constantly in fear of a new world order, it appears as though that they're all too thrilled to welcome us into one. A new world order where America has chosen to take a seat at the kiddies' table and let China and Russia take control of the global stage. Trump is a transactional coward who is causing irrevocable harm to our strength on the global stage. And I need to remind all of his sycophants that this world moves on with or without you. Ukraine isn't going to comply with these deals, nor should they have to. And when we've been sat aside and turned into some kind of nuclear-powered pariah state, not unlike Iran or North Korea, will the libs finally be owned? Will you finally be satisfied when all shame and decency has been taken away? Anyway, I appreciate you hanging in there with me, and if you would consider it, please like and subscribe and share. It really helps get the message out. Y'all come back now. You hear?